Well, good morning, everybody, and I'm so glad we paid a premium for the views. But welcome to Visions London, and for those I haven't previously met, my name is George Roberts. I lead the Cushman & Wakefield business across the UK and Ireland, and it's great to see so many of you here today joining us this morning. The view, I promise you, from this building does remind me just how easy it is, I think, to take for granted what a fantastic city we have the privilege of calling our working home. Not a time goes by when overseas colleagues visiting don't collar me to say what a city London is. And I was reminded of this recently in a discussion with a client that had worked away from London for several years in the Far East. And he returned and he said to me, sometimes you have to go away and to come back to realise just what London offers compared to other world cities, which was a real reminder to me. But turning to today, as we look back over the last year, whilst it's been a challenging environment for real estate, it's worth highlighting that we have plenty, I think, to be positive about. Despite the slow end to the year, economic growth is still surprised modestly on the upside. We saw 2 cuts to base rates and somewhere in the region of £50 billion transacted across the investment market, significantly higher than the £40 billion that we saw in 2023. We saw a decisive election result, which gives some stability to decision-making in the short term and continued demand for real estate. But despite that, there are obvious challenges that we have ahead. The repricing of the bond market we've seen in the first few weeks reminds us of that. There's increased geopolitical uncertainty and a polarization of views across a number of key themes that impact our real estate, particularly when it comes to decarbonisation and inclusivity, topics that we at Cushman & Wakefield are very focused on. We continue to be in a period where we are rethinking our real estate. We're understanding customer needs and aligning real estate to those needs is more important than ever. The disparity between the best and the rest, what works and what doesn't, is only getting greater across all of the sectors in which we operate in, which presents significant opportunity, but also risk. Our aim through Visions and the conversations we're going to have today is to shine a light on the cyclical and structural changes that we're seeing and to help chart a route forward for positive change in the year ahead. And we are immensely grateful to Emma, to Harry and to Rob for being part of today and in truth being the real stars of the show. But let me hand you over to our star, Daryl, who's going to compare the event. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Nice to see you all, and thank you for joining today. So, as George said, Visions is our view of the key themes that we believe will impact UK real estate during the course of the next year to 18 months. Now, I'm not going to get a chance to get through them all today, but they cover a range of topics. George has just alluded to a couple: decarbonisation, AI, geopolitical uncertainty, just a few of them. I'm going to touch upon a number of these today, but otherwise I would encourage you to have a look when you have a moment. They won't be the last word on the subjects, I have to be honest, but what we've aimed to do is give you some food for thought over the year ahead, where we expect to see that significant change. The theme we've chosen for 2025, as George said, that we believe weaves through all of these trends is that continued rethinking of our real estate. George mentioned that mix of elevated interest rates, of technological change, of changes in the way we work, travel, the need to decarbonise, and that drive towards experience in real estate. They all coming together with the market movement that we've seen recently to drive questions around repurposing, repositioning, and that reevaluation of our holdings across real estate, whether you're an occupier or an investor. Now, this is something that we highlight in a number of different ways, in particular across Rethinking Reality, which we worked on with our friends at Gensler to paint a picture of the complexities involved. This is something we will come back to. The first topic I wanted to touch upon, first key theme for the year, something we optimistically called the right time. And it's a view that 2025 will see an improvement in liquidity across the capital markets. Now, I'll be honest with you, it's a view that's been stress tested during the first few weeks of the year. And probably if we were doing this in November, I would have been a little bit maybe more bullish talking about it. But we'll pick up on that in a second. Before we do that, it is worth a reminder that during the course of 2024, we did see a number of things happen which are fundamentally good for investment. We saw headline and core inflation come down significantly. We did see those rate cutting cycles, which George mentioned, from the Bank of England, but also the Fed and ECB. We did see the economy surprise on the upside, even if the end of the year was a little bit weaker. And we did see that election result, which in the context of what's happening elsewhere, does provide some relative political stability. Focus on the word relative. So I think the first things first, we did enter 2025 rather in a much healthier economic position than we entered 2024. Now, last year was still very much a difficult environment for deal making. I've been assured of that by my capital markets colleagues. This was a market that ended up close to £50 billion, which in the grand scheme of things certainly isn't the end of the world. But it's not a market that was running at £75 billion just 2 and a bit years ago. But I think there's a few things to highlight as we go into the new year. The first is that deal making has started to improve in terms of the overall quantum of deals during 2024. That was actually 30% up on the year before and just 4 to 5% less than the annual average we've seen since 2007. The second point where we've seen those upticks in volumes on the right side of the chart. So data centers, logistics, hotels, healthcare, particularly retail. This is at least in part driven by underlying structural sectoral drivers, which have the potential to continue to drive that investment. Third point, I think particularly important point, is that as of Q3, total returns were running positive year on year for all sectors, with the exception of offices. So really strong showing from retail. Doesn't tell the whole picture there. Actually, shopping centres and retail parks both seeing returns of around 6%. Even offices where that recovery has been a bit more slower and a bit more polarised. Annual total returns in London, so across the City and West End, both turned positive during Q3. And the final point to make is that the UK continues to show resilience. Last year, the UK saw the most investment activity across all European countries. And by the end of Q3, had seen investment close to the equivalent of Germany, France, and Spain put together. Even those who operate in the central London office market, where that has been difficult and volumes have been muted, central London still remains the most liquid office market in the world. So when we think about the prospects for liquidity over the year ahead, we should bear those points in mind. In order to try and do that, we at Cushman & Wakefield have been thinking about this in quite a lot of depth. Our economics and forecasting team have tried to pull in together the drivers of timings of market entry and exit in what we call our time score. And what this does is take into account REIT performance, relative pricing of our markets compared to our forecast, lending sentiment, as well as the outlook for risk, and packages them together in 4 categories: cyclical, momentum, risks, and growth trajectory, which is, it's easy for me to say. The good news is that at the end of the year, our time score was up on all measures and hovering at 3.2, up from 2.2 a year previous. The bad news is that since then, we've seen a bit of movement. So Gilts have been as high as 4.9%, the highest level since the financial crisis, and 60 basis points above where they were in December. Now, it's relatively well versed by this point that this certainly isn't just a UK issue. We have started to see bonds come back in, but there has been an amplification in the volatility in the UK compared to other bond markets. So in terms of our view on the market for the year ahead, we do take the view that there is still a reason to be positive, that inflation and gilts will continue to come down. However, that elevated level of risk that we are currently seeing, it does create uncertainty during the first few months of the year, and that will weigh on sentiment. But going back to the US comparison, which I just alluded to, it's worth remembering that the inflation picture in the UK is quite similar to that in the US. If anything, it's slightly better. What is a lot worse is that outlook for economic growth. What would have a very positive impact on liquidity on our markets is any upside to the prospects for economic growth during the course of the year. New government has come to power with a primary mission of delivering the highest sustained growth in the G7. And hopefully we're in a period now where we move away from that discourse just around inflation to one that is focused on growth, albeit it's one against a backdrop of little fiscal headroom, increased trade barriers, and an already high debt burden. But let's ignore that for a second. In all seriousness, the government has put its cards on the table on growth. So the new incoming industrial strategy, the pension reform, commitment to the growth of the green economy, Keir Starmer last week outlining plans for investment in AI through the growth zones and improving computation capacity, as well as, of course, the reform of the planning system and house building. To our mind, these are all broadly sensible, to be honest, but there are two questions. Firstly, is there any fiscal firepower to help stimulate that growth? And secondly, to what extent will this generate growth in the short term? And I think those are two very pertinent questions. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. Brings us to one of the points just touched upon, which is planning reform and house building. We addressed that in vision number 7. And the expectation that if government's plans have the desired effect, this would and should create a development boom for the housing sector. Now, it's worth highlighting, we're in London, that the new standard method in the revised MPPF actually reduces London's housing targets, albeit they are higher than the draft targets that had been announced a few months previous. But nevertheless, they're, of course, a lot higher than we've seen the rate of delivery. What these targets don't do is take into account the ability of the market to absorb new homes or the makeup of what that delivery looks like. Last May, we released a report called The Shape of Real Estate, which took a view to 2040 and estimated that not only do we need 11% more real estate across commercial and residential, but that specifically 4 million additional new homes would be needed. This would suggest that even if we do see 1.5 million new homes built over the course of this government, a not too dissimilar rate of delivery would need to be maintained in the medium term. The key point is where this comes from. Assuming social housing stays at similar levels, obviously the government has the ability to move the dial on that. We suggest there would be a 43% growth in the PRS sector during this time, with the sector moving from 19% of housing to just under 25%. And this is in addition to growth in care homes and seniors housing, which is needed for our ageing population. Now, it's worth pointing out that planning is definitely not the only constraint. In England, there are around 235,000 planning permissions granted a year. Of that, about 170,000 of those are built. There's been 1 million unbuilt homes since 2019. In many cases, this is driven by a lack of viability, not only because of rising costs, which we've shown on our screen, but also because of increases in standards and changes to funding. Now, this is clearly a gargantuan challenge, which obviously we're going to fix in the course of the next 50 minutes or so. But getting it right is more than just about profitability. It's about creating that environment where investment risk and reward are balanced in a way to attract capital through new approaches to delivery and scaling. And I'm sure we will get into this in a bit of detail. The other driver that will drive redevelopment is the review of MEES, which the government announced just before Christmas, if you saw it. The outcome of that will be out in February. And the good news is that since the original draft consultation was announced for MEES Grade B by 2030, the proportion of buildings that will be uncompliant have moved from 90% to 83%. I mean, definitely less. So, the not so good news is that based on our analysis of 32,000 buildings, which we believe is quite thorough, we've estimated that the cost of MEES Grade B is £71 billion. That would require rental growth and yield movement in excess of that seen over the course of the last 10 years. No small challenge. Brings us to vision number 9, raising standards. If MEES is the bottom up, then what we are seeing elsewhere is a top-down evolution of real estate standards. The balance of value for real estate has fundamentally changed. Despite the economic pressures we've seen over the last few years, all property rental value growth has continued to be strong. It's increased to an average of 1%, up from 0.4% between 15 and 19. Now, this has partly, but not wholly, obviously mitigated the yield impact, which has seen total returns fall. But there continues to be a change in what we require from our real estate, whether that's greater experience, greater amenity, more flexibility, more optionality. We've seen a greater focus on location, a greater focus on service. All of these things are talked about all the time. This does come at a price. This is not unique among sectors, but I just want to draw out the example of central London offices to close, seeing as we're in one. What we've been trying to do is understand the quantum of buildings that fit new standards. So we started creating a basket, so BREEAM Excellent or Outstanding, EPC A or B, some degree of outdoor space, a small selection of facilities, flex space or gym in building, doesn't need to be both. Quite generous parameters to our mind. We put all of those in a basket together that totaled just 89 buildings, and of those 89 buildings, they averaged a size of 220,000 square foot. So when we get into questions about the future of offices and how that's suited to what we need, fundamentally, we're dealing with a market where there's a mismatch between supply and demand for what people want. This is driving pricing and will continue to drive pricing. We often hear the phrase less but better. We just want to quantify what we've seen that mean over the course of the last few years. So since 2020, the top 10 largest deals across central London saw occupiers take 10% less space than they previously had. All 10 of those companies paid more than they were paying previously, to the tune of 93% on a per square foot basis. Even when you take into account the smaller space take, that leaves a 73% weighted increase, equating to a rent roll of £115 million larger than it was. Of the top 10 deals in 24 alone, the rent roll increased by 178%, an equivalent of £81 million. Where that is needed, where those occupiers are wanting that different types of space, this is coming through. Before I leave you, I just want to make a final point. Over the last few years, we've seen wars across Europe, across Africa, huge escalation in the Middle East. Last year, we saw elections in half the world's population, and by and large, the incumbent lost, highlighting not just a dissatisfaction with the governments, but in some cases, a more extreme politics than we've seen. We've seen supply chains disrupted. We've seen cables at the bottom of seas broken. I was on the train to the Paris Olympics, very fortunate, where the cables into Paris were cut. Don't worry, I got there. I can see you were concerned. In the last 2 days, we've seen a new president in the US come to power and once again withdraw from the Paris Treaty, despite its most populous state currently being on fire. We've seen the promises of widespread tariffs in February, and this has already affected the price of sterling on our markets. We've seen a halting of DEI programs within the US government. A large number of companies shift their stance on DEI, inclusion, and hate speech. Why does this matter towards real estate? I think the last few decades, certainly in the UK, but across many advanced economies, we've made great strides on decarbonising. Obviously not to the extent we would have wanted, but made great strides nevertheless. Made great strides on energy generation, plenty to go, and on driving social value through what we do, whether that's across our cities and places or catering towards neurodivergence in our offices and our shops. Could go on with 1,000 examples. Don't worry, I won't. Up until 10 years ago, it felt like we were on one path towards breaking down trade barriers. Up until now, it's felt like we were on one path towards decarbonisation and sustainability and on one path on delivering social value and inclusivity through our places. This is no longer the case across governments in different advanced economies or major organisations. I dare say it's no longer the case that it's just one path across real estate. Now, I'm not here to be political, but what I will say is that in a world where we have choices, it's about making the right one and doing it with conviction. Now, before I welcome the panel, I'm going to hand over to my friend here to wrap up.
I'm the AI version of Daryl, and I hope you're having a good morning. Sincere apologies that the other Daryl didn't go into too much detail on AI impacts. Maybe I make him nervous. Anyhow, our view on how AI will change real estate covers investor decision-making, development, use in building management tools, and through increased demand. It's vision number 8, if you want to go back and have a read after today's session. I just wanted to wrap up and say thank you again for coming today. It was mentioned at the top, but it bears repeating. If you want to dig into any of these themes, then we'd be more than happy to do that with you. Otherwise, there's nothing further to do other than welcome our chair and our wonderful panel to the stage. Speak soon and thank you. Dankeschön. Merci. Grazie. Sicher. Shukran. Obrigado.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to virtual Daryl, and thanks to real Daryl as well. But I think that's proof that machines are definitely going to take over the world. I guess AI replacing our head of research is a long-term is a question for the long term. What we're trying to, or what we hope to cover in the next sort of 45, 50 minutes is the outlook for the short term as we ponder our visions for 2025. And I think most of us would agree that the short-term outlook, as Daryl reflected, has probably never been more uncertain. There's something about talking about visions in the lookout and the fact that the cloud has completely descended upon us, which is almost the perfect metaphor. I guess I've had to kind of rewrite this introduction on an almost daily basis as last week's spike in bond yields and increased uncertainty over base rates and inflation gave way at the end of the week to a record high for the FTSE 100 and the IMF increasing their forecasts for UK economic growth. So it's a very fast-moving picture. And it's never been a better time to be the person sitting here asking the questions, or a more challenging time for our expert panel to try and answer them. So we are extremely grateful to all of you for giving up the time to come and talk to people today. So I'm going to do a quick introduction to our panel. Rob Perrins is the CEO of Berkeley Group, a role that he's held since 2009, having joined the board in 2001. And under Rob's leadership, Barclays has just been named Britain's most admired company. And also, importantly, from a real estate perspective, you've just returned to acquiring sites with acquisitions in Maltspur Park and Hersham. Emma Cariaga is the COO of British Land. Company Emma joined in 2014, and she's just been appointed as Chief Operating Officer, prior to which Emma headed up Living at BL and led the 53-acre Canada Water development project. Emma's got an incredible track record in central London development, having held development and land management roles at Landsec, Barratt and Crest Nicholson. Harry Badham joined Hammerson in 2021 as Chief Development and Asset Repositioning Officer, responsible for development, leasing, marketing and the on-site teams across Hammerson's city centre destinations. Before that, Harry worked at AXA and Allied London, and his CV includes schemes such as 22 Bishopsgate, the Brunswick Centre and 6 Pancras Square. And last but not least, Ben Cullen. Ben leads Cushman's offices division in the UK, as well as our office sector group for our UK and Ireland business. Ben's an office occupier specialist with 23 years experience advising some of the world's leading organisations, some of which are represented here today, including Amazon, L'Oreal, Meta and PwC. So the format for the rest of the morning, we've got about 30 minutes for a panel discussion, and then we'll hopefully have about 10 to 15 minutes of questions from the audience before a hard stop around 5 to 10. So let me start with a nice easy one. As we said, 2025 has started with some headwinds in the bond market, a falling pound, albeit it's bounced back quite strongly in the last 24 hours. Added to which, as Darryl observed, there's rising tension across the world, and the PwC ULI report highlighted geopolitics as the key trend of 2025 for investors. So I guess the opening question is, are you glass half full or half empty as we look over the next 12 months? Rob, perhaps we can start with you.
In some ways, I think, as Darryl said, I think it's quite difficult if you try and look for a business in a 12-month period. And I think you have to go beyond 12 months. In some ways, it's much easier for me to explain what Barclays is going to be in 10 years' time than it is where it's going to be in 12 months' time. And why I'm moving by that is that there's a lot of volatility around. There's a lot of moving parts. I think all businesses are spinning plates fundamentally. There's lots, and some of them will crash. And it's really interesting when you know, Darryl mentioned the viability challenge, and there will be things that work, and then it will move further out as optimism comes in. And you know, what are the three things we're looking for in 2025? And you know, from a planning point of view, you know, we government have done incredibly well to change a mindset. You know, I support them wholeheartedly in the mindset change in terms of, you know, the MPPF, Marks and Spencer's getting planning at Oxford Street is a huge sign to you can invest in the UK. It's interesting, I was in America and they mentioned that. You know, that was a real sign that we can come here. We're not going to get held up by a minister just making up his rules. So mindset change the brand. The mindset is yes. You've still got to get into they're not really resolving the regulatory piece. You know, you know, it's not, you know, I'm not, you know, regional and local, we still, you know, we're not going to be as brave as Ontario, who said, regional government, you're out of the planning system. That's not going to happen in the UK, but they have to be brave. They've got to disrupt. They're not doing enough. Unfortunately, you know, as I described, saw the housing minister on Friday, the train has gone, you know, literally the train's gone from 5 miles an hour to 30 miles an hour. We've got to get it to 120 miles an hour. How are they going to get it to 60 miles an hour? And we're all coming up, and what I find is really interesting, we're all coming up with ideas. We all know the ideas that they need to do, but they're not quite seeing it through. And I think policymakers are really struggling with the next steps. And it is political. They've got to make political choices. What's really important to them, you know? And there are trade-offs, and I think they're really struggling with the trade-offs. And we've seen with Trump, he's really been clear on the trade-offs. I mean, whatever, love him or hate him, you know where you stand. I mean, you know, there's two genders. Fundamentally, he's made an executive order. You know, there's no misunderstanding if you're in America where you sit, and you're either in or you're out. we've got to get. I don't think we need to go as far as Trump and as radical as Trump, because I think there's parts that are wrong. But we've got to be bold in that one. Secondly, in our sector, in some ways, in the next 12 months, what is one of the big risks that's blocking UK and everyone on development and resi, and really stopping at the bottom of, in any scheme, is the building safety regulator. The building safety regulator, well-intended regulations came in, and the plethora of regulations, but the poor old building safety regulator has fallen over, and we've got to come up with rules, and we're really trying to help government come up with rules, but they're really struggling in how to resolve that. Gateway 2 and Gateway 3, and it's driving investment. I had a small developer onto me, small in terms of 300 million. He's out of the UK, he's not in London, he's out of the UK, and he's in Barcelona, and he's in Madrid. Why? We've got to really change that mindset in the building safety regulator. In my meetings with government on the fiscal side, is there any money that Darryl asked? There's no money. So fundamentally, there is no money. There's no coherent policy. I mean, Darryl talked a very good game about industrial strategy, but if you could tell me what it is, I'll be really. Fundamentally, they sort of 1 minute they want to increase demand, then they increase stamp duty on the resi. There's no coherent policy, and they can't really work out that policy. But so we know there isn't any money to resolve these issues. So we have to make things work. From a business point of view, the issue you've got to do is be much more innovative, and we need innovative solutions. And what I mean by that is, in some ways, is that we've got a lot of secondary office. It's not our core business. We've got to think of a way of doing it, and probably Emma can help me. Do I set up a flex office? Do I do something? I've got to hold the capital. I've got to come up with different capital structures. Why did Berkeley move into build to rent? The problem with it is the return on capital employed is not as good. Fundamentally, businesses are facing a lower return on capital employed. And the American shareholders I saw and Canadian shareholders I saw are saying, I'm not investing in London if your return on capital employed is at this level. And this debate with government has got to be had. And government don't get that point. You talking to the mayor and you go, I've got to have a return on capital employed of X, or I won't get the 30 billion of capital you require to build the London homes. And that debate, I might as well talk to the clouds, really, because that's how opaque government are about capital. They really don't understand capital and cost. So the American shareholders are saying, I don't want. Why do I come to the UK? I can make 20% in the US return on capital. And return on capital and growth and ambition and success and failure is actually allowed. Whereas in the UK, you have a failure, so we become too risk averse. So businesses will be risk averse. So I think 25 is going to be we're in that market where we were in 94, 97. We're going to bobble along. There'll be some good bits. There'll be some bad bits. It'll go up and down. I deal with Darryl completely. September, I was more optimistic. I set a strategy on the 6th of December. It lasted until literally today or whatever. When the bond yields moved, I wish I hadn't said my 10-year strategy because it changed. So I think you've just got to be very adaptive in this environment. And I've gone on for too long.
Well, I think the aim of the aim of the panel was to get people to sort of speak their minds and say what they think as we went through it. So I think it's great.
But I love Michael Gove now. I've gone back in. I like Michael Gove. I've been in therapy on Michael Gove. If you want the whole meeting on Michael Gove.
Michael's not here, I don't think. Is he?
Oh, is he not? I wish he was.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. So Emma, I guess same question to you. For BL, and what's your kind of take on the short term and how you see the next 12, 18 months?
Sure. So I need to find my own politician to talk about. There's plenty. We can come to that. I echoed a lot of what Darryl had to say earlier, and I guess I'm coming this morning after a briefing we had last night to our board from a former head of the MI6, who comes annually as a bit of a teaser at the start of the year to sort of give his two penneth on what the world of geopolitics is doing. And you always sort of go in super excited because he's former head of MI6 and has got some interesting stories to tell. But you always come away feeling slightly depressed, actually. And last night was no exception, because there was not a lot to be cheerful as he sort of marched us around a metaphorical atlas of the world, giving his perspective on what's happening, what's happened versus the update he gave us this time last year. He did spend a lot of time on the US, and his take on what Trump says and what he does was interesting. I think this time round his sense was there was going to be a real test of loyalty in terms of the weird and wonderful that he's surrounded himself with, which I think we've all seen playing out over the last few days. But when you start to look at those executive orders and the timing and the narrative, I think there's quite a lot to look at there in terms of how one moves and delivers an agenda, which is very clear, as Rob outlined, but he's no fool. And he apparently starts the day and ends the day by looking at the S&P 500. And, that's, I think, quite an interesting takeaway for the UK in terms of, how we need to deliver on this growth agenda and, what matters. And financial markets matter and capital flows matter. So that was an interesting perspective. Why that's relevant is, I think, when you look around the world, it is a pretty shitty, scary place, actually, in many places. And yet the UK is and remains a relatively stable, democratic, weird at times for sure, but a safe place to deploy capital if only we can demonstrate we have the confidence and ability to do stuff with it. So I think all the ingredients are there, and I think that bodes well if we can find a government minister who's prepared to take on and deliver a vision that we can all coalesce behind in the way that I think Trump, like him or loathe him, has managed to do. So that's our context for us as a business, and you then overlay for us the markets that we're in, which are offices, retail parks, and to some extent residential. And I think we feel from an occupational point of view pretty positive, actually, in terms of prime office market, central London. We had a roaring success last year with leasing. And retail parks have had their strongest year in over a decade. So, I'm on the glass half full camp. I think we need some regulatory support, and I think we need a government that's going to actually make stuff happen. But the capital is there, and it wants to come. If only, if only it knows what it needs to spend it on, and the returns are to be had.
Great, thank you, Harry. Same question to you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a danger of having three developers on the panel and starting to talk about the planning system. I am the only developer, perhaps the voice of one, who says the planning system is absolutely fine. The problem is all the bits that are being added on the side, and the second problem is how it's administered. The same planning system that's given us this incredible change in the city over the past 10 years is the same planning system that applies in all the areas where we're struggling. So the planning system is fine, but when you have anti-development committees or open democracy, and you have a million layers of, whether it's environmental regulations or anything else, sorry, we are going to go through a therapy session about planning, but I'm going to get this off my chest quickly so that you don't have to speak to me about it again. I think it comes back to this point around growth. The government can talk about growth. What creates growth? Investment creates growth. I personally am very optimistic for the reasons Emma said as well about what we're seeing from the sort of supply-demand side. Yes, there's a concentration. The averages of all these sectors we see from Darrell hide a lot of a discrepancy between what is working and what isn't working. I think there's still a lot of stuff out there that isn't working, and it is a difficulty to see how you invest in. But the prime cities in this country and frankly across Europe, the prime infrastructure nodes in this country have created an incredibly strong base. And again, that sort of all those cultural factors that we talked about provide that incredibly strong base. So when we see businesses invest, and look, we see it on our assets, when we invest and when we see our partners, our tenants invest, the growth is there. Absolutely, the growth is there. The challenge is that needs money, and exactly that point. If I liken it to, maybe this is a bit grandiose, but I liken it to evolution. There's a natural selection process. Retail has gone through that, by the way, pretty kind of observably. Office is probably in the middle of it right now. There is a natural selection process. Now, when that happens in nature, it's the world, it's the temperature, it's all sorts of factors. When that happens in business, it's capital. Capital chooses where it's going to invest. And when capital can choose at times like this to invest in risk-free, and not to go through whether it's a planning application that is a 50-50 chance of success or is going to drag on for 3 years, by which time policies change and other constraints come in, or when you're taking on risk of development and all of those risks that are inherent in development, probability risks. The capital just won't go into it. It needs, as Rob said, to have the right risk return. So I would go as far as saying very positive, because I think the fundamentals are there. I think what we need, and the bit that relies on some probability and some understanding, is around what the conditions are to get that investment into every aspect of this country, and that's public and private sector. We have the same with all of our local authority partners across the UK. They go, well, that's fine, yeah, you can upgrade the road, but you're paying for it. Or, yeah, that's fine, the high street we recognise looks a bit shit and needs a bit more policing, but you can pay for that. So it's like the private sector can't take everything. There needs to be this sort of symbiotic relationship of investment, both public and private. And that's the bit where the probability over the next 12 months will come about how is that investment? Because it's very difficult to make investment where you're looking at future returns. Again, there's a great book for anyone who's book-minded called Mega Projects and Risk. It's by a guy called Brent Flyberg. And what it says is that these investment projects, they're always exceptionally difficult to underwrite. And yes, often they go over budget. And we look at Crossrail HS2, they often go over budget. They often go over time. But the lasting benefits always, in every case, massively outweigh the original assumptions and massively justify the original investment. So if we can get that investment right, if we can create that sort of that extra over bit rather than just the basics, I think we're in a really good place.
Great, thank you. Ben?
Thanks. I suppose as the only office agent or agent on the panel, I've got to fulfil the positivity role. It's part of my DNA. I'm guaranteed to cheer up any board meeting in January. I think if we take a step back and look at the macro side of it, perhaps a good way of describing what I see for the economy in the next year is perhaps look at the Chancellor's week last week. So she started off on Monday with many commentators thinking that she's not right for the job. Cost of borrowing's out of control. By Wednesday, the inflation figures had come in for December, which were lower than expected. So the pound begins to rise, cost of borrowing starts to come in again. People start talking about interest rate cuts. And then on Friday, the IMF turns around and says, well, actually, of the G7, only the UK, along with the US, is showing a revised growth upwards. And actually, the UK is the only large economy in Europe to show much growth worth talking about at all. So that volatility and that fragility, I think, of the economy is clear and plain for us all to see. On a serious note, I do remain relatively positive. I think office occupation and take-up of office space around London and other regional cities is quite a good barometer of economic health. Occupiers don't make decisions to spend a lot of capital and invest without being relatively confident in the medium long-term future. And we're seeing a relatively healthy market right now. I think generally speaking, whether you like him or hate him, I think Trump will be reasonably good for the US economy, and what's good for the US economy, tariffs aside, is generally good for the global economy. So I think we'll see reasonably strong global economic performance over the next 12, 24 months. I think we have avoided a recession which was on everyone's mind at the end of 23 and at the beginning of 24. And we are beginning to see inflation globally come under control. That should lead to interest rate cuts over the course of the year. Most economic forecasters are predicting that. And then finally, looking at the government, and there are many on this panel that will know the government, certain individuals of the government much better than I will. But the reality is that we have a new government which is getting used to governing. And I think that, again, whether you like the government or not, they have a clear plan and certain policies, some of which will fail, some of which will succeed. But we need to give that government time for those policies to gain traction and to make an impact on our economy. So whilst I believe that we should be understandably cautious, I think we can also have room for some optimism in our thinking for the year ahead.
Great. Positive start. I mean, I think that there's a few subject twos, and Rob, I think your take was that it's better than Michael Gove, but there's quite a bit to do. I mean, I guess on a kind of related theme, Darryl talked about development boom and the push to build new houses. And obviously, we're only going to have a development boom if the supply side starts to match the demand side of it. And we've touched on planning. there's a hugely ambitious target of building 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years. And I think, Rob, you talked about the mindset shift. I guess one of the challenges how that kind of percolates down to the people that are making individual decisions on the ground. So how confident are you that we'll get there in terms of unlocking the needed boost to housing development?
I think you'll get there in terms of greenfield development. I think you'll get there in terms of the issue is going to be brownfield development. And if you're trying to get 80,000 homes in London built, what you're trying to do in Birmingham, Manchester, London's only building 8,000 starts the year to date. There's a huge order to go, and it needs a real focus to make these schemes viable with a huge viability gap. The Mayor tried before Christmas to come out with a revised plan about how you follow the rules, but did it really move the dial enough? No, it didn't move the dial enough. I mean, he sort of said that his 42 supplemental planning guidances, 42 of them, one on fracking in London. Talk about that one, that's quite a good policy. No one fracks, by the way, but we've still got to check it, 5,000 quid report. But I've lost my theme there, but fundamentally, this is what I said about choices. You have to make the choices of what your priorities are. And I think politically, they haven't made those choices. And this is what I always spend in meetings with them, and Harry half touched on this, if your priority is affordable housing, which it has to be, if your priority is great places, which we all believe in great places, fundamentally your output on great places and what you're doing at Canada Water is creating a great place, mixed campus, fantastic places. And we talk about local amenity. Is it doctor surgeries, what local people really want? What you then can't have is all your design guides. Dual aspect has taken out 40% of a building form, 40% of a building form. The changes obviously in fire safety. They said, the rules just came out before Christmas, you won't need a second lift with a second stair. The rules came out just before Christmas, you need a second lift with a second stair. Again, these rules are, is it needed in risk terms? This is where you get to choices. They want a community infrastructure levy. So sorry, on the build costs, the additional build costs on those design guides are about £50 a square foot. The sill that we have to pay community infrastructure levy to mend potholes across London, £75,000 an apartment. It works out at 100 quid a square foot. You can build the 35% affordable housing and fast track everything, but you can't have all the other things, or you get zero affordable. Those discussions aren't happening in the political debate. And that's why I get into very clearly is you've got to have that. If that really is your priority, affordable housing, then make it your number one policy. Growth, houses, affordable housing. Then everything should be geared towards that, and you cut out all the others. So we urge government, led by Treasury, the housing, we talk about what they're going to do on new towns. I think they'll get there on new towns, but he's not going to report for a year. The London plan is not going to be updated for 18 months. Have a Treasury task force with all the experts on it, politicians, whatever, 12 weeks, led by Treasury to say, how are we going to get brownfield built and get these 80,000 homes in London, 20,000 homes in Birmingham, Manchester, and coalesce around the mayor. If they go down devolution, which they believe in than devolution, it's going to slow it up again. So, again, they've got to really work this out. And great job so far. So I'm supportive of what they've done so far, but they really need to get going on the next stage. And I'm not seeing that happening yet. We've got I don't know if anyone's ever interacted with I think there's a sort of a government unit that sort of is supposed to sort out all planning consents. I can't remember what it's called.
Stall sites.
What's it called? Stall sites. Because I think it starts with, there's a stall sites department. Sounds something that you do in the morning. But anyway, but basically you sort of, this stall site department, which we all write into, we put all 30 sites in. It was, when was it? Was it June, July, August? I can't remember when it was.
Who knows?
Haven't heard, I haven't even responded. The stalls, it's literally, it must be a department somewhere. He's got a lot of these things, and that's the real urgency, and it's about local. But look, confidence-wise, I think things will work. We will find solutions. We will get more planning consents will come through, and sites will start becoming more viable. What the government have got to get over, and I think the GLA have got to get over, is we're not going to get economic growth in house prices to outcome the problem. And that's what they think is going to happen. They think prices are going to up 50%. House prices aren't going to move up that level to get them out of the issues. And therefore, they do need to really work through their priorities.
I mean, my sense of a couple of the points you made is about trade-offs. And I do wonder whether there's been a lack of honesty that there are trade-offs. And that's probably where, Trump's been very clear, hasn't he? If we do this, then we're not doing that. And whether there's just been a lack of clarity that doing these things involves not doing these things, and some of those things are stalled by reviews and strategic reviews, which just sort of kicks the can, I guess, is the point.
But they have to make their choices, and if they won't make those choices, if they won't, you don't have to go down and burn it. And I'm probably at the extreme of sort of burn every supplemental planning guidance is supposed to be guidance, should be burnt, and then we'll just work it through the London plan, do everything on a case-by-case basis, and they say, we can't do that because of the lowest common denominator. But you've still got good checks and balances with the local. So you've got to be really radical, and you've got to disrupt quickly, or this government will be through. Yeah. And I know exactly what's going to happen. They're going to then come straight back to us, hopefully Emma or Harry first, and say, you haven't built the 1.5 million homes because you didn't do it as a business. We gave you all the tools. So the blame game's going to start, and that's the worst area we must win. So that's why we need to get a mindset to get close. They won't hit it, but let's get close to getting there. And that's a really good societal outcome. Otherwise, society is going to really, everyone over 40 having a house, everyone under 40, and Farage will be in power.
Yeah.
Cheery stuff.
He will be. He will. Sorry, I mean.
I just wanted to pick up on a point made about there being no money, because that's definitely a consistent theme. But there is money. It's just not being spent on the right things. So since 2010, when Grant disappeared, there has been an exponential increase in things like temporary accommodation. We're spending 366% more on temporary accommodation, or the government is, than we were in 2010. If that was redeployed into funding affordable housing delivered by Berkeley and others through the reintroduction of Grant, you would start to see sites being delivered that were all of a sudden more viable, assuming the costs and the regulatory burden could be managed. So I think we've got to be careful to not take it all as our responsibility without reminding government that there is money within their control. It's just not allocated necessarily in the right way. I don't think planning is necessarily the issue. I have some sympathy with Harry's position. The regulatory issue around fire safety is stopping developers being able to progress sites, even if they wanted to build them, they can't build them. And affordable housing grant is the single biggest issue around the viability of being able to deliver affordable housing. And it is there, it's just not being allocated in the right way, in my view.
Yeah, if I may as well, because I think there's a parallel here with this retail high streets task force. We've got empty property on the high street. What should we do? Let's set up a department, because these greedy investors and owners of buildings who are deliberately keeping their space vacant, that's the problem. The government can sort this out. It's like, I don't meet many real estate owners who keep their space vacant. If we can't let it, odds are that the government department with a 12-month lag in actually responding to a tenant inquiry or an investment requirement is not going to sort it out either. So I think we have to take a little bit of collective responsibility as an industry, and by that I mean all sectors of the industry, for the brand we have in the public mind, because we do, like it or lump it, live in a democracy, and there are different flavors of democracy out there. There's Trump's democracy and there's our democracy. But the point is, when I talk about planning committees who are anti-developer, they see developers as being greedy, or they see asset owners as being sort of almost feudally rich. And this is not the case. The investment that we put in to keep our assets relevant is enormous, but is unseen. So I think we have a duty collectively to kind of try and get that point across the government about leave it in the hands of the private sector. The private sector is a very efficient allocator of capital and will invest. But all the tinkering and all the the departments. And I don't particularly want to sort of go back across the pond and start talking about Elon Musk, but if you watch him talk about how you improve a process, the first thing you have to do is delete the process.
Yeah.
You know, the first thing you have to do is strip away all the unnecessary bits that have been tacked on. As I say, come back to planning, sorry. The system is fine. It's the bits that get tacked on around environmental regulations or biodiversity net gain or dual aspect, or everyone has a different view on some of these subjective things. It's a question of, as I say, it's just a question of getting that moving by being prioritised.
Brilliant. Ben, I'm going to change tack slightly, if that's okay. So we talked about the work you've done attracting or helping multinationals looking to find a home in London. What are your clients saying to you about London? What's attracting them to London? What are the threats to that continued appeal of London to the global occupier?
Sure. Well, I think, look, I'm in a privileged position that I'll often spend half my day, as will the team, sitting in the back of a people carrier apprentice style with some very senior leaders from global businesses around the world. And if you spend that much time, my chat's pretty appalling, as you can tell. So they tend to talk to me a bit more. And you end up with some really interesting insights coming back. And I think that the first statement I'd make is London remains a highly attractive place for our occupiers to base their businesses or to invest in outside, let's say, the Americas, which is predominantly where many of these big, large global businesses are coming from. And I would split the reasons why into probably two camps. The first is the structural elements, our geography, the English language, the time zone, the regulatory environment, love it or hate it, our politics. So those are the fundamentals that make the UK and London an attractive place to be. But then you can overlay the softer factors. And one of the things that we should not forget is the importance of people. And again, when you speak to some of these major occupiers, in fact, I was with one only last week, and she was explaining that they have the ability as senior leaders to move around the world. And they're given a certain number of cities outside the Americas where they can go. And she was explaining that always the top of the list is London. And the reason why London's at the top of the list, if you think about it, is education's great. Many people will have trained there or been to university. You've got a wonderful city where you can bring up a family. It's safe, fundamentally, touch wood. It is broadly a safe place to be. And then you can overlay the cultural aspects. So it's perhaps not a surprise that many businesses, when given a choice as to where they want to be or where they want to invest, they choose London. Another thing that I think George commented on when he was opening a few minutes ago is that we have an amazing office market. We produce some of the best buildings in the world, if not the best buildings in the world. But what encourages me more, certainly in relation to the Americas, perhaps less so when I look to Asia Pac, is that we're using them. We're returning to the office. And again, these are major decisions that big businesses are having to make. Where do they put their investment? Into countries, cities, around the world where they're going to get the return on that investment. We talk a lot about innovation, productivity, bringing people together into places where they're going to move that business on. And fortunately, we seem to be getting that momentum back into London and the UK generally in terms of that use of the office space. And let's not kid ourselves, those are important criteria now for leaders around the world, and they're expecting that from their people. So if you combine all of those together, I'm really optimistic, and I think as we saw last year, generally in terms of take-up in London, it was positive. It was pretty much at last year's figures and not far off their 5-year average, which is really, really good. And I look to the future this year, and I remain confident we're going to do the same again. I think we're going to see less reliance on professional services, legal sector, financial and business service sector. My tip is look to media and tech. I think we're going to see a lot more a much greater return to them being a driver of office take-up than we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years since COVID. So generally very optimistic.
Great, thanks, Ben. Right, we've got a few minutes to open up questions to the floor. I think Natasha and Tom have got some roving mics. So anyone have a question for the panel?
Thank you. Very interesting panel session. Thank you. I heard or I read Michael Portillo said the other day that, and obviously as a well-known railway enthusiast, he would have a good view on this. His view was that modern political government ministers lack the bravery to govern. Does the panel agree with this? And what can the business community do to support any change?
Anyone want to go first?
Interesting. You had a political outcome of. We had a presentation about Keir Starmer actually, which is quite interesting. And Keir Starmer, what they said is the first prime minister since Thatcher that doesn't care what people think of him, and that's a really good thing for a politician. And if you do take him, he doesn't seem to care what people think. He's going to do his thing. It doesn't matter if he's unpopular. And therefore, I think there's some positivity around, it's very early days in the government. We all get very caught up in the bond market, and there's positivities around it. And I do think the government are making all the right steps. I'm delighted Rachel Reeves went to China. I mean, slightly mentioning 600 million was a mistake when Trump mentioned whatever it was, 500 billion yesterday. But fundamentally, if the UK can get a trade deal with America, if they can get a trade deal with Europe and a trade deal with China, we'll grow in London. London will be a place. As you said, we've got all those great attributes, but the problem is we take our attributes for granted. So Starmer not caring, I think, is a really good positivity. So I hold a lot of store into that. I think that there's a disconnect between governments, and you've got this, you can see this across the government when you talk to them. You've got the Reeves camp, and you've got the Wes Streeting camp, and then you've got the Rayner camp, and all the rumours going on about if they're talking or not talking. I've got no idea if that's the case, but they seem to be sort of, all the rumours. But actually, if people can have a 5-year term and they stay in, I think it could be quite positive. And so actually, to answer that question, I think he is there to govern because he doesn't seem to worry. I might be completely wrong. I might be by that analysis.
I think I would agree with that. My only note of caution would be, can they go fast enough? Because I think to your point earlier around 5-year term, they have a majority, but we know there is some challenges to that majority. And if they they need to be brave. And they need to bestow a vision that we can all, I think, get behind and then do the stuff that business needs to be able to deploy the capital. And that needs to happen, I think, this year. So I think the indications are positive, but we need more of that and probably a quicker pace.
Yeah, it took Blair a few years to get things moving, didn't it? Before we had a real estate boom, early 2000s. They come in '97. It does take time. It does take time. So I'm, as with these guys, positive, but I think it will take a bit of time to get fully behind it.
Okay. Any other? We've probably got time for one more question, I think.
Hi, Tom Larson from Grow Places. Thanks everyone for the panel discussion. I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into trust. In that sense, you talked a little bit about trust between public sector and private sector, and then also between both of them and local people, and that being a really key thing to unlock this speed. And so for you all who are in obviously very high positions and connections to government, you mentioned examples around viability where you'll spend a lot of time do the public sector actually trust the viability that you're bringing forward, for example, as developers. So have you got any thoughts on how we can kind of short circuit some of that or build that trust?
I'll have a go. I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it depends on which spanner or layer of government you talk to. I think relations with planning teams and planning officers, I think, has been quite good through the last few years. We've had to share with one another, respective challenges, open up our respective books in terms of where the challenges are around viability, and so I think it's all to play for. My sense is there'll need to be a bit of risk sharing to be able to see that trust ensuing, and what I mean by that is fundamentally lowering of affordable housing delivery quantums or tenures until house builders and developers' margins start to improve. And that will encourage, I think, the industry to deploy more capital and should be self-fulfilling. That's not a place we've typically been, I think, looking back, where there's been such a level of disclosure between the private and public sector. But I think that's coming, and I think that's to be commended. I don't know whether you're closer to it.
I mean, government are trying to come up with a viability scheme, so there's some rules around it. And you agree that there's all this sort of black art of how the viability is put together. And the the area that you get to, and it was said earlier, is that fundamentally, if you are, especially on the housing side on viability, if you have, they fundamentally think developers are making too much profit or we're paying too much for the land and the gain is elsewhere. And that's why I go back to about the local priority. I think if you look at outcomes you want and you get the outcome society, you say over the long term, people forget about the viability very quickly and we spend all our time then working about a review mechanism. And that's why I go to absolute clarity. The easiest borough to work into London, and you don't get caught on viability, is Tower Hamlets. He's very clear that you can go as high as you want. He wants 4-bed social housing. He wants 35% affordable housing. He doesn't want any sill. He'll do sill in kind, and that's what he wants. Whatever you think of his policies and his politics, is very clear. There's not a trust issue there with the planners. It's very clear. And I think they've got to set out their clarity of, as I keep saying, what are the priorities in that local community? And if your priorities are community infrastructure levy to do things across the borough, you've got to be very clear with the local community that's where the benefit is going for. And I don't think we do a very good job of saying, actually, for our Fulham Kings Road Park, we're paying £120 million of sill. That is paying for a lot of libraries, paying a lot of things across the borough that local community aren't getting the benefit of. And we don't really explain that. And we don't get the politicians to explain it. It's not a world to say, the politicians say, oh, this development's paid for this. And I just think we ought to have a much more open debate about it and get away from this viability of planning becomes very adversarial. And as was mentioned earlier, we've done it for government. I mean, sales prices in London since 2016 are up 6%. Build costs are up 44%. Land prices for resi is now lower than is for other uses. So you're not going to get the homes that you require in the first place unless there's a real debate around it. So, but I agree with you, it's about then the benefit of explaining it to the local community. And I think when you do explain it, people then settle down and explain it. We're in the press at the moment. Everyone knows in Peckham, we own the shopping centre in Peckham. Why are we had a scheme of 35% affordable, but they had to put more density on it. They refused to put any more density on it. The local politicians did. So at that dense scheme, you're not going to get to your affordable housing level. But that honest debate will never happen in the press. It's just going to be, Berkeley are ruining Peckham at the moment, which we're dealing with in the press.
Well, I think it goes back to a point that Harry made, didn't it? The public perceives us as a sort of greedy property developers.
You're absolutely right, Rob.
Get that message
that building there gave 50 million quid in sill. And there's nowhere is saying this road junction is funded by 22 Bishopsgate. Yeah. Perhaps other businesses are just better at lobbying than us, but we don't see this from Pharma and other businesses. No one looks at the profit they're making and goes, that's really unfair that they're making so much money out of flogging that drug. We get this sort of, almost like the public perception is the negative bit. So I'd say the trust is limited at the moment. My viability advisor will say I need a 20% profit on cost, as by the way will my shareholders and my board, whereas the council's viability advisor will say 12% is more than enough for you, and it's just a number on a page to them, and you go, fine, I'll fucking build it then. Sorry. The proof will be in the pudding.
Great negotiation style.
But a lot of the investments we've made have not required that. So the investments we've made in repurposing department stores or reletting space or investing in, the trust comes from delivery as well. And I think where we've got better relationships is where proof is through delivery. So I think that it kind of sits on both parties. I'd like to see some more people who have been in business and who have been responsible for capital in whether it's planning committees, whether it's planning officers, or whether it's central government. I'd like to see a bit more of that, and I think those of you who are public spirited, perhaps you want to take that challenge on. I think the opportunity for Homes England to perhaps have some of that role is there when we're talking about housing specifically. But I think there's a bit of onus on us to put proof where we can in delivery, and as you say, to kind of mark those bits where there has been a public benefit that is sort of not necessarily seen at the ground level.
So look, we're pretty much exactly 10 o'clock. I get a gold star from Rose if we can stick to time. I'm trying to think what happens if we go over. So I guess in conclusion, I mean it is a challenging and fast-moving environment in which we're operating, and we really are very grateful to the four of you for coming up. We gave you quite a wide-ranging brief, which was, anything that's kind of relevant to the real estate market over the next 12 months. So to come up and face those questions and, give the kind of honest and forthright views that you have, we're really extremely grateful for. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then it just remains to say thank you again to Daryl for your presentation, both real and virtual. Our Visions report is available on the website if you don't have a copy of it. But also, what we would really like people to take away from today is that we don't have all the answers in Visions. Actually, it's a really interesting conversation starter to think about what the next 12 to 18 months could look like. And so if you're interested in continuing the conversation, please get in touch with Daryl or me or Ben or your contacts at Cushman's. And otherwise, thank you very much for coming. Thank you again for the panel. Thank you to Daryl, and have a great day.